So this is the new, I believe it's a physical education and complex. So it was beautiful. It's a little less beautiful now, but we're going to talk about the pharmacology of hallucinogens, but specifically LSD and psilocybin will be something that we cover pretty much all the way through. There is also going to be some mention of DMT, because that's another intense hallucinogen or potent hallucinogen that seems to be something that's been used for centuries. So as usual, we're going to go through the usual suspects, the sources, history, chemistry, epidemiology, and then we're going to cover the actual pharmacology, specifically the kinetics and dynamics of these hallucinogens. I didn't really divide it up because the differences are more in like the timing and maybe metabolism, but a lot of them are metabolized by the same enzymes. They all affect the same receptors to a greater or lesser extent somewhat, but we'll get into that. So it's not like recovering caffeine and nicotine that affect two different receptors to get all together and have, you know, a lot of differences in terms of kinetics and dynamics. All of these drugs are in the same basic class. They all have similar kinetic characteristics and dynamics characteristics. So of course, on this one, we're down here in the psychedelics. So where's my pen? There. So I can start crossing things out for you. LSD, LSD, ayahuasca, I think it's funny that they put it on here, but that actually contains DMT, and then psilocybin, which is from magic mushrooms.
What's it called? Psilocybin?
Hmm?
Psilocybin? Weed?
Yeah, we'll get into that, but psilocybin. So psychedelic or mind manifesting was coined by a British psychiatrist, Humphrey Osmond, in 1956 to refer to a unique class of mind-altering chemicals with distinct effects that set them apart from other drugs with hallucinogenic properties. Some psychedelics come from natural sources that have been traditionally featured in religious and ritual and healing practices of indigenous cultures in the Americas. Psycholytics or mind loosening refers to a type of psychotherapy conducted in the 1950s and 60s in which relatively low doses of LSD were administered during psychodynamic therapy to facilitate the emergence of repressed material. So they were using it kind of like the CIA would use a truth serum, quotes, although there is no such thing, at least that they'll admit. Anyway, so the psychedelic experience, you'll want to know the meaning of these two terms. An intactogen is a type of drug with a particular psychedelic properties such as MDMA or ecstasy and related compounds, which refers to the ability of such a drug to promote personal introspection, or intactogen meaning a touch within, as opposed to an entheogen, which is an alternative term for full psychedelic drugs such as LSD and psilocybins, which refers to the ability of such drugs to evoke transpersonal knowledge of God, possibly God within as well. But so the idea is that you can get in touch with yourself with some MDMA, but you can get in touch with everything and yourself and how they're connected with LSD or psilocybins. I think that's the gist of it, if you wanted on, you know, sidewalk talk. But the touch within and transpersonal knowledge, I think, are the ones that I would keep track of for these two terms. All right, so a mystical experience refers to an acute awareness of a transcendent ultimate reality, or as some might put it, God. What? Well, that's why they put transcendent ultimate reality, because if you don't believe in God, you might experience something that you would describe as a transcendent ultimate reality. If you do believe in God, you might visit with him for a little while, or her, or whatever your higher power might be. Just saying that's what these people believe a mystical experience to believe, or to be rather, and that's how I would describe it as well. So ergotamine is a natural product of this particular fungus that affects all kinds of different grains. Amongst them, the one I think that at least I had heard about was rye, and it's called Claviceps purpura, and it's a fungus that grows on the grain and makes it look kind of purple or black. And then eventually, so that's here, and this would be I think some barley or wheat with ergot fungus, which is Claviceps purpura. So ergotamine from that fungus is the natural initial substrate that is then, through this chemical procedure, so don't try this at home, but this is just to show that through a few steps you can turn this natural ergotamine from the fungus into LSD. And so that's how LSD was initially synthesized. And this is the chemical structure in the nomenclature of an organic chemist, in a stick figure and then a more three-dimensional figure I believe the important part is along this line, but we'll get to that. So that's the three-dimensional structure being rotated. Once again, the important part right in here. So this is serotonin, which is the neurotransmitter that LSD mimics. And it's specifically this portion right here that's mimicked by LSD, and that helps it to bind to certain serotonin receptors. Sources of psilocybin, of course, almost all of them, I think, are mushrooms. And then this is just listing the genus, I believe, of a number of different mushrooms that contain psilocybin, or psilocybe, I think, but we'll get into that. Anyway, psilocybin, not quite as big or complicated a structure as LSD, but does maintain this nitrogen carbon backbone to a nitrogen, which is right here in the stick model. I'm going to be chasing this thing around all night, I can tell. DMT. What are sources of DMT? And what is DMT? It is dimethyltryptamine, NN dimethyltryptamine. And that just means that the methyls are attached to the nitrogen. I'm not going to ask you about that, but if you're interested in organic chemistry. And it naturally occurs in plants, animals, and there are some medications that contain it. And here's your Jabba the Hutt, the Sonoran desert toad that occurs in Arizona and Texas and New Mexico, and I think northern Mexico, is a animal source of DMT and 5-methoxy-DMT. So you may hear about some kind of party, I don't know if you call it a rave, but where people lick the toad. And there's also, when it comes to plant sources of DMT, fungi are not exactly plants, but they are also a source of DMT as well as psilocybins. And then the rest of these are genera of plants that naturally generate DMT. And it is generally believed that it was Central American natives that used some plant sources of DMT in their spiritual rituals as a way to contact the spirits, or what we might call a higher power. And this is DMT's chemical structure. If you're keeping track, that's the nitrogen to nitrogen carbon backbone that is conserved, and that's its chemical structure. And DMT is a functional analog or structural analog of the other psychedelic tryptamines, such as, I'm not going to ask you about this one, but it's an acetylpsilocin, which could be written another way as a cousin of DMT, 5-methoxy-DMT, of course, bufotenin. I think that's how you pronounce that. But anyway, that is also a closely related chemical structure that is actually even more widely available in plants. And then psilocybins, which is 4-phosphate-DMT, and then psilocin, which is the inactive precursor of psilocybin. So all of those are very closely related. So obviously that type of structure has something to do with being able to bind to the serotonin receptor, because they also have similar effects. And it's biomolecularly similar not only to serotonin, but also melatonin. So here's serotonin, and there's that nitrogen to nitrogen backbone. Here's melatonin, another natural hormone in your body. I wouldn't worry about this, but if you get migraine headaches, these are the medicines that are frequently given to people with migraines. Sumatriptan is Imitrex, zolmitriptan is Zomig. And down here are the psychedelics. So you've got psilocybin, 5-methoxy-DMT, LSD, and ibogaine, and they all contain that same serotonin chemical structure. Yeah.
No question. So like every week you show us these, and like, so are these little things floating around in our bodies? And like, where are these things that you're showing us?
Well, it depends on which one. If it's something like serotonin or glutamate or something like that, yes, it is floating around in your body. There's plenty of serotonin in your body, hopefully. That would help you be well adjusted. That's the chemical structure. That's how you would write the structure as an organic chemist. And that's part of what I had to learn even before going to medical school, and then again visited in medical school. And I bring it up simply because I think not only are they pretty pictures sometimes, but also it helps you to understand how chemically similar these things are. No, this is the real thing, but I mean how similar serotonin is to psilocybin, which is to DMT, which is also to LSD. And even though, you know, each of these has its own unique effects, they together all have similar effects to a certain extent. And so I'm trying to, I guess, help you with some of the reductionist view of pharmacology, in that we've isolated the active compound in magic mushrooms, and it's psilocybin. So we have some idea as to why these mushrooms are psychoactive. All right. So this is a timeline of various discoveries regarding hallucinogenics. I think on here, it might be interesting to note that Albert Hofmann synthesized LSD in 1938, but didn't really realize its psychedelic properties, or psychoactive properties at least, until a good 5 years later. And it wasn't until 12 years later that the first animal tests were even done. And it wasn't until 1988 that there was a serotonin receptor that was identified that's actually the main target of LSD. So that's a long time. That's 33 years from the discovery. Well, not 33, it's 33 since the first animal testing, but even longer, like 45 years since it was first discovered to have psychoactive properties. And another point I'd like to make on here is that it wasn't until either the 90s or the 2000s that the dose of LSD could be monitored in human because, or the distribution, I should say, because the concentrations are so small. So this is just looking at the number of papers published in a year from 1950 something or other, 58 through 2016 regarding psilocybins. And you can see that there was around the beginning of the 70s a real spike in research, and then it fell off with the introduction of the Controlled Substances Act and remained relatively low, and only in the mid 2000s or 2010s rather, around 2016 did it start picking up again. And then, so this is that previous slide showing that there's some activity there, and this is showing how much activity there was in terms of papers published regarding LSD. And you can see that there was a lot more research on LSD than there was into psilocybins. And once again, it peaked around 1970, and with the introduction of the Controlled Substances Act and LSD being Scheduled 1, any research done on LSD became a lot more difficult bureaucratically, and the number of studies dropped off fairly precipitously. And I would say there's been some resumption in studies, but nothing like the change for psilocybins and possibly a few others like ecstasy. And then once again, since I don't have numbers necessarily for the number of people, we're looking at the number of manuscripts or the number of papers that were published. And this is on a scale of 0 to 60. This one's on a scale of 0 to 350. And we're looking at ayahuasca down here. So almost no activity in that through 1950 to the mid 90s. And finally, some research into ayahuasca, which is DMT. And this is looking at also the difference between psychedelics and hallucinogens in general, which could be LSD, and then ecstasy and psilocybins here since 95 roughly, and showing that there is a little bit of activity for DMT directly, but not much. So when it comes to the epidemiology of hallucinogens, as usual, we're going to refer to the National Survey on Drug Use and Health from SAMHSA for adults. Actually, it's for anyone 12 and older. The category that they list for hallucinogens is quite broad, and it includes some of the other things that we cover in a different module. So there's the hallucinogens as I categorize them, like LSD, psilocybins, and DMT, and those are the ones that I think I primarily covered in lecture. But it also includes a number of the dissociatives, like PCP, ketamine, peyote, and mescaline. And their hallucinogen category also includes the entactogen, ecstasy, or MDMA, and salvia divinorum, which I don't really try to cover much. So, like I said, it's broad, and unfortunately, that's the best we have to go off of. Let's see. So, hallucinogens, past year initiates, so people who tried it for the first time in the last year, there were about 1.3 million people that tried a hallucinogen in that category. And the one that we're looking at specifically out of that category is one in red here, LSD. Between when they started the survey, roughly in 65, and about the turn of the century in 2000, the hallucinogen category was dominated by LSD. Around this turn of the century, of course, ecstasy became the primary hallucinogen. And so it accounted for most of the hallucinogen users because they were using both, either ecstasy or LSD, or both. And as you can see, the majority of them were using ecstasy, and then some of them were also using LSD. And since then, ecstasy has remained relatively popular, although it has dropped off, and LSD has regained popularity. So this has been looking at lifetime users of hallucinogens, and same idea, basically up till the turn of the century, most hallucinogen users were LSD users. Since then, it's been about 50% or maybe 60% of hallucinogen users are LSD users, with a growing number of people having tried, at least at some point in their life, ecstasy. I did manage to find an article that was reviewing the data from 2002 to 2019, looking at psilocybin users, and these are lifetime psilocybin users in the various age categories, as well as overall. And there's been a slow but steady increase in the number of psilocybin users over this period. Most of those have been in the 26 and older category. And there's been a declining number of younger psilocybin users, which, like we talked about before, may be at least between 18 and 25 and the 26 and older group, just an aging effect. The people that were using or had tried psilocybin as young people got older, and now they were being categorized as 26 and older. But amongst the 12 to 17-year-old group, there's also the same decline, so it's not purely aging. The popularity of psilocybins amongst people 25 and younger is declining. DMT, on the other hand, or ditryptamines, have not been declining in popularity with any age group. Overall, in purple, this is having ever tried one. And then overall, for past year use, there was a drop off in use around 2014 to 2016, and then a resumption in, or a increase in the number of users, again surpassing the peak in 2014 by 2019. And the major group that's using tryptamine, of course, is the 18 to 25-year-olds. So when it comes to past month substance use, 40% of people aren't using a substance, 60% were. In 2021, for hallucinogens, that was roughly 2.2 million people that were past month users, which, as you can see, is a substantial number, given that it's only beaten by alcohol, nicotine, and marijuana, and about the same as pain reliever misuse. So then this is looking at the time trend for hallucinogen past month use. Obviously, back here in 1981 or 79, I guess it is, there were a lot more hallucinogen users, but I don't have any breakdown because they don't give that data. And the number of people that were actually using LSD in the past month is small. So small, in fact, that this data looks like, at least in these 2 years, there was nobody using it in the past month, which of course isn't true. So I made another graph that we'll look at, because here you've got PCP with no users in the past month for most of the period. All right, and then looking at past year, roughly a 80-20 split. 20% of people had used some illicit drug in the last year, with about 7.5 million people having used a hallucinogen in the last year. And I don't really consider marijuana a illicit drug, because in most states there's some type of program for using it, and in more than half the states there's a recreational program for using it, so it's not actually illegal. So amongst the illegal drugs, then these two, of course, are pretty close, but prescription pain relievers and hallucinogens are the two top categories, at least the way they break things down. So then, once again, this is looking at past year, and I have data from about 94 through 2021, and you can see a decline in use after the turn of the century, and then a rebound in use prior to the pandemic, and actually continuing during the pandemic from 19 to 20, and then a small decrease 20 to 21. So enduring use. And then this is looking at past year hallucinogen and LSD users over the same 2002 to 2019 period with an age breakdown. So overall, hallucinogen use in past year has either been stable or slowly increasing, and LSD use has been slowly increasing over this period, with most of the increase amongst 18 to 25-year-olds. So then this is looking at the difference between initiates, lifetime users, past month, and past year users. And you can see from this that this is a classic example of something that people try and don't often use very much after trying. So you've got a large or relatively large number of people that have tried one and growing, but the number of people that are using one in the past year or the past month has been small and relatively stable for past month use at about 1%, and relatively stable during this period for past year use at around 2 to 3%. If you throw in LSD, once again, you can see that the majority of people that are trying one back here are trying LSD. And of course, around here, you get the addition of ecstasy. So same thing though, people try LSD. So they've tried it in their lifetime, but they generally don't use it during the last year and they don't use it during the last month. Very small number of people. And this is on the log scale, so you can see what we're talking about, but it's on the order of 0.1% of the population that uses LSD in the past month to maybe 0.2. So this is looking at the same information, past year hallucinogen users, but slightly more recent information, and that is from 2020. And the overall, right there, 2.6% of the population. And this is looking at past year substance use disorder. You can see that it doesn't even make the chart. That the number of people with a substance use disorder from using a hallucinogen is small. And this is looking at treatment admissions, so it's not perfect data. And this is from 2010, but there's not a whole lot of data on people who are or who have a substance use disorder from a hallucinogen. And you can see that the number of admissions here, we're looking at 60, and that's for white males, on the order of 30 in any one of their age categories for white females. And the majority of white males are between 12 and 30. The same for white females, 12 to 30. And there's not much use of hallucinogens amongst Mexicans, Puerto Ricans, American Indians, Alaskans, Asians, or Pacific Islanders. And then this is looking at age breakdown of lifetime psychedelic use, also by gender, looking at any psychedelic, LSD here in orange, the one we're looking at right now. So definitely people that are older, between 25 and 65 are the majority of people that are using LSD. Psilocybins is a little younger, from say 18 to about 30. And then mescaline and peyote are both used primarily amongst people in the 50 to 64-year-old category. So for kids, well, I call them kids, but anyway, 8th, 10th, and 12th graders, it would be in this category that we're looking. And although it's this monitoring the future study, they're saying that in this young adult category, which is 19 through 30 years old, that hallucinogen use is currently at an all-time high, and that it increased, basically doubled between 2011 and 2021. Looking at the well, this is combined for 8th, 10th, and 12th graders. You can see that hallucinogen use is not at an all-time high amongst these grades. It actually reached a peak around 1996 at about 7% and has been declining since. And the one we're specifically looking at is LSD, which rapidly declined about the time people started using ecstasy. And this is looking at the 8th, 10th, and 12th grader breakdown in terms of use of LSD, and then any hallucinogen other than LSD. So apparently this was the heyday for LSD use, and hallucinogens other than LSD were used primarily in the late 70s, early 80s, most likely representing PCP. So that's the breakdown for hallucinogens. Like I said, it's fairly popular amongst the illegal drugs, only number 2 compared to prescription pain pills. So some pharmacokinetics. Much of the pharmacology of LSD was not determined until recently, like 2015 to present, and this is due to the exceptional potency of the drug and the extremely small doses that result in effect. That's 30 to 300 micrograms. Technology capable of actually detecting a nanogram quantity, that's 1/1000th of a gram of the drug or its metabolites, have only recently become available. And when it comes to routes of administration, we got a whole mess of different hallucinogens, but for LSD, it does have some activity orally, and it can be absorbed not only when you swallow it, but also directly through your skin. And that's a special property of LSD, is all you have to do is touch it. And in fact, that's claimed to be how Mr. Hoffman first found out that it had psychoactive effects, was he was synthesizing it and he accidentally got some on his hands and went for a very extended trip, shall we say. DMT, they say here that you can have some effect swallowing it. I have read that is not actually true, so I would knock that off. It's not going to be a quiz question or anything, but DMT, along with a number of other drugs in this group, can be inactivated by what's called monoamine oxidases, and those are the same enzymes that inactivate serotonin. And DMT is particularly sensitive to the ones that are in your saliva and your gut wall, and so you usually have to take a monoamine oxidase inhibitor for the DMT to have any effect when it's taken orally. Now, you'd think only a pharmacologist would know that, but actually the people who made ayahuasca had found that the, I believe it's ibogaine plant that contains the DMT had no effect unless they added this, I'm gonna get the name wrong, but anyway, we'll get to it, this root that contains a monoamine oxidase to the tea. The combination of the two made a potent hallucinogenic tea, but without that root, it did nothing. And most people take mushrooms by ingesting them, so psilocybin oral. I mean, I guess you could snort them, but I'm not sure that would work out. Have a little mushroom growing out of your nose. So this is basically saying what I told you, that indigenous tribes of the Amazon rainforest effectively discovered that DMT was rendered orally active if combined with a monoamine oxidase inhibitor. Of course, they didn't explain it in those terms, but long before the advent of modern biochemistry, and presumably through experimentation with different combinations of plant extracts. And it's this substance, harmaline, is the actual monoamine oxidase inhibitor, and it's from this vine, yage, I think. But that's what the vine looks like when it's chopped up. That's what it looks like when they're making the tea. And the leaves from this ayahuasca plant are what contain the DMT. And then you add this yage root, and that's how you make a ayahuasca tea that actually works. It also makes you throw up, so it's a lot of fun, just like mescaline. I didn't hear that. What was that? All right. Right, contact her afterward, not me. The oral bioavailability, this is just more pharmacological diagram showing that you can ingest the two together. It will actually pass successfully through the intestinal wall, where normally it wouldn't pass successfully, and it won't actually be totally metabolized by the liver, and it will then get to systemic circulation and have some psychoactivity. So when it comes to absorption, LSD is orally bioavailable at roughly 71%, so that's pretty good. Onset in 10 to 30 minutes, and duration, the hammer, 12 to 14 hours. So you're going to be wishing that you had fastened your seatbelt and properly stowed your tray table by the time you are done with that. Psilocybin's much shorter duration of 4 to 6 hours. DMT has an onset in less than 45 seconds and a duration of 5 to 15 minutes, depending on the dose. And the peak effects are usually reached in about a minute. So this is your, I guess, weekend warriors trip. And this is your long hair, what were they, well, yes, hippies, but the guys that went around with the magic school bus, only they didn't call it the magic school bus, it was just the magic bus. Anyway, the merry something pranksters. There you go. See, this thing works sometimes. Anyway, so this is looking at the LSD concentration in your blood with time. So this is absorption here, and looking at two different doses. You get the 100 microgram dose or the 200 microgram dose, and you get roughly 1.4 versus roughly about 2.8 maybe. So when it comes to actual blood concentration for double the dose, you get double the concentration. They both have a extended metabolism and elimination curve, as you can see. This diagram, if you can see it, shows the average dose, and I won't get into the name, but these compounds are all in the same group of organic compounds. But this one is 30 to 300 micrograms. For DMT, you're looking at a dose that's roughly 100 times that. So 100 times as much at 60 to 100 milligrams. For ibogaine, you're looking at a dose that's roughly 20 to 50 times that at 2 to 5 grams. So psilocybin, 10 to 30 grams, or milligrams rather, 10 to 3 grams. We're going to see if you can overdose on psilocybin. We're going to administer 10 to 30 grams. You like a cow sitting there, munch, munch. That's a lot of mushrooms. Are you sure? Anyway, and the active metabolite of psilocybin is this psilocin. So once this phosphate group is removed, it becomes psychoactive. So part of the reason why LSD lasts for so long is that it's 80% plasma protein bound. So as soon as you're taking it, a whole bunch of it's binding to proteins and thus creating a reservoir of LSD. So as soon as your liver or any other part of your body metabolizes some of the LSD, that's rapidly replaced with some of it coming off this protein reservoir and replacing it. So that's what gives it the extended release type, 12 to 14-hour half-life. And it readily crosses circulatory barriers, so the blood-brain barrier and also the maternal placental barrier. As the drug penetrates the central nervous system, rather, it concentrates in the visual brain areas, the limbic and retinal activating system brain areas, which correlate with much of the perceived effects. So a lot of the hallucinations that you get are visual, especially right away or almost right away. And some people, I guess, call that frying because everything looks like it's melting. And then eventually it's found, LSD is found in the liver, spleen, and lungs. The volume of distribution is relatively low at about 0.28 liters per kilogram. So on the order of a tenth as much as many of the other drugs that we've looked at. But in a large part, that's because this thing binds to protein and also is, I believe, lipid soluble. So LSD here is metabolized by your liver using these enzymes, but this one is one that we come to frequently, into nor-LSD or OH-LSD. And that's the initial metabolism of LSD. Psilocybin is metabolized also in the liver from this psilocybin compound that's present in the mushroom into this psilocin compound, which is actually active in your nervous system to cause the hallucinogenic effects. Then that is subsequently metabolized either by this MAO enzyme, which is the same one that metabolizes DMT, or it can be actually metabolized by a number of other things, or even a whole bunch more things. But anyway, it gets metabolized, let's put it that way. Another fun fact is that LSD's plasma half-life was determined to be 2.6 hours, and the elimination is via a 2-compartment open model. So that's talking about the plasma protein binding, but also I believe the fact that some of it goes into the fat. So, oops, trying to draw and it's going away. I believe its concentration was maximal after 1.5 hours and gradually declined to very low levels by 12 hours, and that's by first order kinetics.
Lysergic acid diethylamide, or LSD, is a potent psychoactive substance that is commonly classified as a hallucinogen or psychedelic drug. The effects of LSD vary substantially depending on the dose, the mood of the individual taking the drug, and the environment the drug is taken in. Some common effects include mental and physical stimulation, perceptual distortions, and generally positive mood states. Although we have some understanding of LSD's activity in the brain, it is not fully understood how this activity leads to the subjective experiences people have while taking the drug. Regardless, it is thought that LSD's activity at a subtype of serotonin receptor, known as the 5-HT2A receptor, is critical to the drug's psychedelic effects. LSD acts as a partial agonist at the 5-HT2A receptor, which means that it binds to the 5-HT2A receptor and generates a response that is a fraction of what the natural ligand serotonin generates. LSD also interacts with other receptors, although the role of these receptors in the effects of LSD is less clear. For example, LSD binds to other serotonin receptor subtypes, as well as some subtypes of dopamine and adrenergic receptors. Research suggests that one large-scale effect of LSD on the brain is increased glutamate transmission in the frontal cortex, which is thought to play a role in the effects of LSD. Repeated administration of LSD over several days promotes rapid tolerance, where the drug has much less of an effect than it did initially. This tolerance is thought to be associated with a downregulation or decrease in number of 5-HT2A serotonin receptors. LSD is not, however, considered to be addictive, and although it is a potent drug, it is generally considered to be non-toxic and safe in terms of its effects on the body.
Okay, pharmacodynamics. So how does it melt everything? Hallucinogens act primarily by binding to the serotonin, that's the 5-HT, which is serotonin, to binding sites in the brain's frontal cortex. Both tryptamine and phenethylamine hallucinogens bind there, and the most sensitive binding is to this 2A receptor type. That's probably very important to know. The 2A receptors are found in multiple areas of the brain and most strongly expressed in areas that have previously been involved in psychosis, psychotic symptoms, such as the prefrontal cortex, the striatum, the ventral tegmental area, or VTA, that we've been studying for quite a while, and the thalamus. So this is an example of researchers trying to figure out what it's actually binding to, whether it's LSD, psilocin, DMT, or mescaline. And these are some of the receptors that they're looking at. So all of these 5-HT are serotonin receptors, and there's a whole bunch of different subtypes. But when it comes to binding to these receptors, you'll note that this is 0.04 micrograms, or actually it's 4 micrograms rather, that's required to actually bind and activate this receptor, and 3 micrograms for this one. So these two are the ones that binds to the easiest. When it comes to binding this 2A and 2B receptor, you can see that it binds after 28 milligrams and 71 milligrams. So this is what you would call not clinically relevant, because hopefully nobody ever takes 28 or 71 milligrams of LSD at once. This is more better shown, I think, in this diagram, so you can get some idea as to the relative difference between these. This is the one where most of the activity takes place, and you can see it just takes a little bit for it to bind to that receptor. It also does bind to this one, the 1A receptor, but that one's not nearly as interesting. And it binds to this 5B receptor and 6 receptor, but whatever, I'm not going to quiz you on that. It also eventually, once you get up to a large dose, binds to some norepinephrine receptors. It can bind to the dopamine 3 receptor, and at a very large dose, it can even bind to this histamine receptor. So I wish I had a diagram like this for alcohol. I have not been able to find one. I don't even know if one exists. But that's the idea, is that as you continue to increase the dose of any of these drugs, that you start to elicit new effects because of binding to other receptors. That's neither as specific or as strong as the binding to the ones that are commonly pointed to as the ones that cause the effect of LSD in this case, or alcohol, or whatever it might be. So this is an actual protein structure for that 2A receptor, since that's the major culprit. And this is showing that LSD, mescaline, psilocybin, and MDMA all contain that binding domain that's similar to serotonin. So they can bind to any of these serotonin receptors, but they tend to bind to the 2A the most strongly and cause the most effect that way. And this is a more 3D model of the 2A serotonin receptor, and it has some psilocybin or psilocybin bound in the binding site. And this is showing how small psilocybin, or for that matter, any of these drugs are compared to this receptor. It's just this little tiny thing right in here that's bound, and this is looking at it blown up a lot. So this is the dose, basically the logarithm of the dose that's required to actually activate the 2A receptor. And this is the potency of the hallucinogen. And you can see that there's a correlation between potency and the required dose, as one would expect, and LSD being by far the most potent. And then you have, I don't expect you to know what DOI, DOB, DOET, DOB plus, DOM are, but DMT and MDA, and then I think up in here somewhere would be MDMA. Those are familiar. So you can see that there's a big difference. Like this is 1 order of magnitude, 2 orders of magnitude. So this is times 10. This is times 100. And by the time you get to DMT, it's times 1,000, the difference in dose that's required to activate the receptor between the two. And by the time you get out here to something like E, it's actually times 10,000 or more. So this stuff is basically a match made in heaven for the 5-HT2A receptor. There are very few other drugs on the planet that work at such small doses. And that's part of why, so little was actually known, that and the fact that it was put on the blacklist for drugs as a DEA Schedule I substance. So this is just looking at what this thing does. It's a G protein activated receptor that then activates through the endoplasmic reticulum's calcium release achloride channel. So This is not instantaneous, like as in you've got chloride going through this receptor. So this takes a little bit longer, but it is quick in that the end result is not having to generate more proteins. It's just activating this receptor that allows chloride to enter the cell. That's the reason I show that. Not that I want you to know the names of all these proteins. That's what I had to learn. So LSD is one of the most potent centrally acting psychoactive drugs. The D isomer is pharmacologically active, while the L isomer is apparently inactive. That's a lovely little factoid for you organic chemistry types, if there are any amongst you. It's okay if not, that's all right, we'll move on. Neuropharmacological studies have shown that LSD exerts a selective inhibitory effect on the brain's raphe system by causing a cessation of the spontaneous firing of the serotonin-containing neurons of the dorsal and medial raphe nuclei. So what does that mean? Well, those are part of what is involved in you being conscious. In this way, LSD acts as an indirect serotonin antagonist. However, inhibition of the raphe firing is not sufficient to explain the psychomimetic effects of LSD. So it doesn't explain why you hallucinate, because the compound glyceride is a more potent inhibitor of the raphe system, but it doesn't demonstrate any of the hallucinogenic effects of that you see in humans with LSD. Therefore, other postsynaptic mechanisms, such as the activation of glutamate or serotonin receptors, may be involved in what actually generates these hallucinations. Also, there's evidence that LSD indirectly exerts effects on the cytoskeleton, which is the construction of the cell, what gives it form, what helps it to move, what helps it to interact with its environment, by reducing the amount of serotonin released by the raphe system. LSD produces sympathomimetic, so that's another term for activating the sympathetic nervous system. Parasympathomimetic, which is another term for activating the parasympathetic portion of the autonomic nervous system, and neuromuscular effects. So it can cause your pupils to, I forget, I think it's pinpoint. It can cause you to tear up. It can cause your heart rate to increase, and it can cause you to have the tremors. So the important part here is that it's pointing to psilocin, LSD, and DMT all exerting this effect and that effect, which is to activate this 2A receptor. Activating this receptor, of course, also then activates this glutamate release from this neuron. But I'm not going to ask you about that. I just want you to know that it's not as simple as activating one receptor and then all of a sudden all the magic happens. It's a complicated system. We're only beginning to understand all of the effects of a drug like LSD. And if you've ever taken it, I don't know how anyone could understand any of the effects of LSD. Anyway, that being said, these are some of the areas of the brain that it's been found to concentrate in. One is one of our favorites, the VTA here, which has dopamine neurons that come out and go to the nucleus accumbens and also protrude out here to the prefrontal cortex. So this is talking about the dynamics of DMT and 5-methoxy-DMT. They both activate the 2A serotonin receptor. The methoxy-DMT also activates this slightly different receptor and the 1A serotonin receptor, and they have some effect on some other mediators, like the serotonin reuptake transporter. And that's a very colorful trip. So some of the effects, well, I would say that some movies are the effects of these drugs, but what I was able to find when you're looking at DMT here in blue and LSD in yellow and psilocybin in green, this is the duration in hours. So for most people, it wasn't even hours, it was minutes for DMT. It was kind of intermediate for psilocybins, and then longer, much longer for LSD. And this is time to peak effect for those same drugs. So DMT on the order of minutes, and then both psilocybins and LSD, the time to peak effect was roughly 90 minutes on average. And that's intensity of effect versus hours. So psilocybin tending to fall off around 3.5 hours, LSD 25 taking more like 6 hours. Now, this is part of the reason why I showed you that earlier one. You get twice the blood concentration, but you get almost the same effect. So this is subjective drug effect from either dose of LSD versus time. And with 100 micrograms, you get this intensity. And with 200 micrograms, you get this intensity. So clearly, there's a saturation of the intensity. You don't get much more effect for doubling your dose of LSD. And this is looking at what effects were experienced. It looks like the biggest one was audio-visual synesthesia. And what that means is that when you hear something, you'll see something. It would be even funnier if when you heard something, you had to say something, but because then you have people that would be talking to each other because they were talking. But it's pretty wild because I guess when you hear something, instead of it registering as a noise, you see so you see the music, basically. And then elementary imagery, complex imagery, apparently not much anxiety. These people must have had good set and setting. Disembodiment, insight, bliss registered pretty high. Spiritual experience. Now, how many drugs have you seen a scale for spiritual experience? I've never seen that before. That's what got me interested. I was like, wait a minute. As my face began to melt. No, I'm just kidding. And then an experience of unity. Boy, could we ever use one of those as the human race right now? And then also changed meaning of precepts. Yes.
I don't know if you remember this, but like there's I don't know if it was a guy or a girl, but there's these people that like had these other people follow them, and then they were taking this stuff, and then they like would themselves or something. Did you ever hear about that? Yeah, it was like yeah, like they like yeah, it was like I don't know, a lot of people do that though. Like a lot of different people do that. Like they make them take this stuff.
This stuff?
Yeah, and then they like tell them, oh, you could kill yourself or something, and then they do it. So
Okay, I have not heard that. What I heard was that in places like Jonestown, they put cyanide in the punch and told everybody they had to drink some. And so everybody went around and had a good dose of cyanide and woke up dead.
no, well, you know,
Okay, I don't know how much of that is rumor and how much of that's actually factual. And I believe that it is part of the reason why LSD was listed as Schedule 1, because nobody knew of any good effects for it yet. And everybody was assuming that as soon as you take enough of it and have a bad trip, you're going to be running for the nearest skyscraper to find out how you can jump off. And it was completely unfounded, as they've done many studies with it now in a controlled environment and determined that it's probably about as safe as taking an aspirin. Just saying.
no, yeah.
I don't encourage you to take it, but
Like, I know they got close together.
no. Now, some of the things that cults say are very trippy. I'll give you that, but unfortunately, it's not from taking something that gives you a spiritual experience. So, as we were already talking, this is just some clip art representations of some of the effects. But the physical effects, it can cause sweating, increased heart rate, increased body temperature, and dehydration. And then this was from a more controlled scientific type study where they were actually looking at typical sensory and psychological effects under the influence of a medium dose of LSD. And they were looking at blood pressure and heart rate changes, and then measurements of somatic parameters like respiration rate, oral temperature, and other things that are important to physicians, I guess, and some somatic symptoms like nausea, decrease in appetite, mild headache, feeling dizzy, stuff like that. So there were sensory alterations of affect. So like feeling euphoria, which is super happy, or dysphoria, which is really sad, anxiety, mood swings, thinking, less abstract, more imaginative thought. I can't imagine why. Broader and unusual associations, attention span shortened. So don't do this and try to study. And changes in memory. And then a list of effects for psilocybin. So it has some of the same physiologic effects, similar visual effects, cognitive. You can have distortions of sound. You can have the synesthesias where seeing something may actually cause sound, or sound may actually cause a visual hallucination, or touching something may cause sound or sight change, which I think would be super trippy. It'd be like you touch the table and all of a sudden everything goes green. You're like, whoa, and then you take it off and it's not green anymore. Green, not green, green, not what the beep. Anyway, and then transpersonal effects, increased what the beep spirituality, a sense of interconnectedness between humanity and a higher power. Now they're speaking my language. Whoa. And so this is the asking people to say what they subjectively experienced after taking psilocybins. And the number one thing was, I saw my surroundings change in an unusual way. Sweet. Where was it? Oh, well, of course, the experience had a dreamlike quality. That's good. They could tell it wasn't real. For DMT, like we were mentioning before, its effects come on rapidly and they also leave rapidly. So in about 45 seconds to a minute, you start to have the experience of intense hallucinations. And then within about 7 minutes, it's gone. And this is just a list of the intensity of the subjective effects versus placebo, not taking anything. So I guess they gave them some DMT, and they gave some other people some DMT that had no DMT in it, and said, what do you experience? And in purple are the things that they experienced. And I think all of them were significantly different, or increased compared to placebo. Just trying to. I particularly liked this one. I experienced a disintegration of my usual sense of self or ego. Often it seems like that one is a prelude to a spiritual experience or a sense of unity. And that leads me to the point that it seems like ego stands often in the way of our ability to see community. Somehow this ego, our ego, stands in the way of our ability to see community. These drugs somehow dissolve that. You have people walking away from these experiences saying they want to, conserve natural resources, they want to recycle things, they want to pick up trash, they want to take responsibility for their contribution to the planet, who may have been, big time litterer before and not give a hoot about things like national parks or the ocean.
It is something that is extremely intense, and I have to say that again.
See, that's a funny thing that you would say that, because there's a movie about people from the 60s and 70s who actually worked to make as much LSD as they possibly could, because that's exactly what they thought. They should be giving it to everyone. Now, I'm not going to say we should be giving it to anyone, but it's not the first time somebody said that, is what I'm trying to say. Huh? I believe it's something like the Sunshine Project. It's a documentary. So hallucinogens increase brain activity and interconnectedness. So this is looking at what they call a connectome. So basically they tried to represent in 2 dimensions most of the connections between different parts of your brain. And anything that's in yellow, orange, or red is an increase in connection. The more red it is, the more the increase. So you've got a huge increase here between the thalamus and the caudate and whatever this is. And this, temporal parietal. And anyway, but suffice it to say that blue is the parts of the brain that experience less activity in connection with each other. And that the diagram shows a lot more red than it does blue. So there's a tremendous amount of activity going on that doesn't normally go on in the brain, connecting things together, which one could hypothesize has something to do with that feeling of unity, but I don't know, maybe. For psilocybins, here's a similar but not the same diagram, and how connected it is when you're not taking psilocybins versus how connected it is when you're taking psilocybins. And this is looking at the level of activity between these 2 parts of the brain. And then this is an EEG, which is just looking at brain activity in different regions as well. But this is DMT, and they're not looking to see which specific regions as much. So they don't have it listed as, 50 or 100 different regions. They have it listed as the visual portion of the brain, the bodily portion of the brain, and the emotional or metacognitive portion of the brain. And so initially the activity is in the bodily portion, then the visual portion takes over for most of the rest of it, and you have some lower level activity in the emotional or metacognitive portions throughout. So there are some factors that influence the psychedelic experience. One is preparation, of course, the type, the dose, the route of administration, the set, which is one's mindset, mental state, intention preceding and during the experience, the setting, the physical and social environment in which the psychedelic experience is occurring, and then finally the integration. So talking with somebody, usually somebody who's already experienced it, often they didn't experience it by themselves either. They had somebody that acted as a guide that helped them through the experience, because for people that are, especially people that are prone to anxiety, having an experience which one might term ego disillusion can result in a panic attack. Because it's kind of like you have a level of insight into the universe, but you're no longer there. You're just able to see how everything is connected, and you're just a little blip on this vast network. This, right? Okay, you may not even be anything. Talk about disillusion. That's ego non-existence. So instead of this happy little dude on this fuzzy little circle, you're no longer there, and neither is Toto. Trips. There are good trips and bad trips and mystical trips, I would say. I'm not going to, spend a lot of time on it, but I do want to mention that a bad trip is usually an episode that results in anxiety, possibly even panic, with severe, potentially terrifying thoughts and feelings, a fear that you've lost control or are losing control, that you're losing your mind, that you might be dead, or even potentially despair, given that a bad trip can last the duration of the drug, which is 12 to 14 hours. A good trip, on the other hand, supposedly is brilliantly multicolored vision, typically unfolding in the mind's eye. Time is dramatically dilated so that minutes may seem like hours or perhaps even an eternity, and there is a dissolution of the ego boundaries. The individual becomes emotionally labile and hypersensitive to both internal and external stimuli, and revelations of a transpersonal or spiritual nature may be experienced. Then the mystical trip is perhaps the most fascinating and controversial aspect of psychedelic drugs, and it concerns reports by many users, among them prominent scientists, psychiatrists, and intellectuals, of life-changing, transcendental, or mystical religious experiences induced or facilitated by these drugs, especially, though not exclusively, LSD. So these are not people who don't know what they're talking about in terms of the English language, yet they are having experiences that they have difficulty expressing in English, and also can be life-changing. One of the changes can be they can go from a smoker to a non-smoker, believe it or not. Oh, well, that spiritual or transcendental type experience can show them the, I guess, insignificance of some of their dependence, some of their cravings. And after that, instead of making hollow promises not to use, some people who have, like, let me see how I can not incriminate the innocent. There was a patient that told me about something to do with someone close to them that was an alcoholic, and they did some DMT together, and the alcoholic wasn't even interested in stopping drinking, but didn't touch alcohol for the next 6 months. So hallucinogen tolerance, it's a consequence of repeated or long-term exposure to the drug, like any other. Organisms over days, weeks, or months become less responsive to the effects of the drug. Tachyphylaxis is the acute tolerance to the drug, though. And in consequence to a single exposure or multiple short interval exposures to the drug, the organism, say you, within minutes or hours becomes less responsive to the effects of the drug. So that's something that's fairly unique to hallucinogenic drugs, is this property. So you might want to know that term. Cross tolerance is, of course, that most of these are affecting the 2A receptor. So tolerance to a drug can diminish the effects of another drug if the enzymes that degrade both drugs or the receptor targets that mediate the drug's effect overlap. So what about withdrawal in humans? Mental tolerance to LSD manifests 24 hours after its first administration, reaches a maximum around 4 days, and remains relatively constant thereafter, and does not reverse unless a few days of abstinence is interspersed. So the symptoms of abstinence, even after, or symptoms rather of abstinence, even after 12 weeks of not taking the drug, don't occur. So basically what they're saying is there really aren't any symptoms of abstinence. And recreational users of LSD, given its rapid onset of tolerance, generally don't even use it every day, because given this rapid onset and then reversal of tolerance, they might use it once a week. And that might be about as much as you can use it, because it just doesn't have much effect. Yeah, so kind of like weed, there have been no documented human deaths from LSD overdose. 8 individuals who accidentally consumed a very high dose of LSD intranasally, mistaking it for cocaine, had a plasma level. Get a load of that. Normally it's on the order of nanograms, and here they have it in milligrams, basically 1 to 7 milligrams per 100 milliliters of plasma, and they were fine. They did. Some people have suffered like a comatose state or hyperthermia, where they're just really, really hot and their body's generating lots of heat, and that's one of the signs of a serotonin type overdose: vomiting, light gastric bleeding, and respiratory problems. But all of these people survived with hospital treatment and without any residual effects. So just don't confuse your LSD and your Coke, whatever you do. And here's the number of emergency room visits from this Dawn system that SAMHSA had set up and funded between 2005 and 2011. You can see the total number of people going to the emergency room because of a hallucinogen went from about 15,000 to about almost 80,000 over the period of 6 years. So that's a lot of people, and that's fast. And my guess is that the majority of those people were using ecstasy and not LSD. And we'll get into ecstasy because that one we cover in a different lecture. So long-term effects, things like flashbacks. Everybody's worried that, if they use LSD once, they'll be using it for the rest of their lives. So what those are considered are very short duration, on the order of seconds to minutes, events where it feels like you're under the influence of LSD or some other hallucinogen. These re-experiences of the previous drug experiences occur mainly following intensely negative experiences with hallucinogens, so a bad trip. But sometimes also can be self-induced by will for positive re-experiences, and are in this case referred to as free trips. So apparently, some people can have a trip without using the hallucinogen if they've already experienced a trip. Anyway, there is a DSM-4 defined clinically significant disorder where you have these flashbacks that are way too often and too persistent, and it's hallucinogen persisting perceptual or perception disorder. It occurs mostly in people who used LSD. And these people reviewed 20 studies that were looking at how many people actually had it and concluded that the occurrence of HPPD is very rare. But when it occurs, it's typical, or it typically will have a limited course of months to years, but can, in some even rarer cases, last for years without considerable morbidity. So there is a chance that you could have a lot of flashbacks, but it probably has happened to literally a handful or maybe two handfuls of people over this almost 50-year period. So these people were looking at what you were mentioning, running for a window when you have a trip. Suicide attempts and suicides during psycholytic therapy with LSD, and these were those studies in the 50s and 60s, and they found the attempts were roughly, in this study anyway, of approximately 5,000 patients undergoing 25,000 LSD sessions, that they had an attempt in 1 in 1,000, an actual suicide in 0.4 of 1,000, and prolonged psychotic reaction in 1.6 per 1,000. In this study, where they had each individual undergo almost twice as many sessions, they had a lower rate of attempts, a lower rate of suicides, and a lower rate of prolonged psychotic reaction. And in this much smaller study of only 121 people, they had no suicide attempts, suicides, or prolonged reactions. Yeah.
How do you spell hallucinogen?
Very carefully.
I'm trying to, but it's like not with you.
HALLUC. So that's the halluc. And then you got to get the IN, IN, OGEN, OGEN.
Thanks. Oh my God, I did like 3 times, like it kept being a little bit like.
It's like,
Yeah.
you're like, I'm tired of the just stop it. All right, so this is a summary of LSD, psilocybins, and ayahuasca. It also contains some information on mescaline and MDMA, but it's looking at the derivation or chemical analogs. So where does it come from? Its general effects or properties, potential harms, and potential therapeutic uses. And you'll note that for LSD, psilocybin, DMT, and mescaline, addiction is one of the potential uses for each of those substances. And I would say also for MDMA, although at the time of making this chart, it wasn't. But other psychiatric issues are also being investigated. Like for MDMA, it's been PTSD. For psilocybins, it's been depression. And I'm not sure when it comes to LSD, because I'm not aware of as much research using it, but it looks like they're looking at anxiety and terminal illness and that sense of connectedness, and I guess to a certain degree peace that one experiences after having that experience, that can relieve their anxiety about dying in patients that are terminally ill. So that's part of the reason why I included this chart, because it does show that there's potential for these drugs to help in the treatment of addiction to, among other things, alcohol, tobacco, and cocaine. But what can help with cocaine can probably help with methamphetamine, and what can help with alcohol may be able to help with opioids. So keep your, what should I say, ear to the ground, eye to the horizon, because there may be additional research that becomes available in the near future regarding the use of these drugs, especially in places that don't consider them to be Satan's tools, like Europe. And that's what I have in terms of my lecture. What time is it? Oh, we got a little bit of time. I have a couple of videos. Probably the one I'd like you to see the most is this one, the just brief 2-minute video.
Humans have been using plants and fungus to change the experience of consciousness for a very long time.
9,000-year-old cave paintings depict rituals with psychedelic mushrooms.
Psychedelics were often used in religious ceremonies as sacraments for divination and healing.
It wasn't until the mid-20th century that science got with the program. Early psychedelics research transformed neuroscience.
We began treating 5 patients for 26 days.
In clinical trials, psychedelics like LSD showed extraordinary potential.
It's an important drug in treatment of mental and emotional disorder.
These substances rose from obscurity to miraculous promise in a matter of years.
Dangerous and deadly. Disastrous consequences.
All of a sudden, there are these scare stories in the media.
Bizarre fatal accident. Permanent brain damage.
Hyped by the government. There's propaganda.
Suicide. Chromosomal abnormality.
Psychedelics were soon perceived as a threat to public safety and global stability.
It's a very dangerous drug. President Nixon went to the Narcotics Bureau today to sign a drug bill.
And by the early 70s, essentially the research has stopped.
The golden age of psychedelic science was over. But this story began in 1943.
A young Swiss chemist named Albert Hofmann is working at a pharmaceutical company in Switzerland.
Tasked with formulating a new stimulant, Hofmann, quite inadvertently, opened Pandora's box.
He accidentally ingests what they called LSD-25, got it on his finger, maybe in his eye, and started feeling strange. He realized there's something psychoactive in this one.
3 days later, he ingests some intentionally.
And realizes, like, oh shit, I'm losing it. Hofmann was having the first acid trip in the world. So he and his lab assistant take one of the most famous bicycle rides in history to his house, where he is separating from his body. He's seeing himself from the ceiling. Then he stepped out in his garden, and everything looked jeweled with dew, as if it were the first day of creation. And that is how LSD was discovered, commemorated on April 19th as Bicycle Day.
Sandoz, the company Hofmann worked for, provided LSD-25 for free to scientists around the world.
They basically unleashed this open source research effort where they offered huge amounts of it to any researcher, basically with a nice piece of stationery.
I could feel with my eyes.
It was LSD that catalyzed our understanding of neurotransmitters and receptors, and also the development of other psychiatric drugs.
Clinical researchers investigated LSD as a treatment for a wide range of mental illnesses.
They looked at obsession, anxiety, depression. They looked especially at alcoholism and had a 50% success rate, which is quite remarkable.
Psychedelics became a standard tool in psychotherapy.
It would help people speed the process of bringing their subconscious to where you can discuss it with your therapist. There was a lot of this going on in the 50s.
There was a dark side to the research as well. Both the military and the CIA saw great potential.
CIA got very interested. First, they thought LSD might be a mind control agent or a truth serum. And then they thought, well, let's weaponize it. Let's put it in the water supply. Let's secretly give it to foreign leaders to make them do and say stupid things. So it was one crazy idea after another. Awful, awful stuff.
But it's what was happening here at home that doomed this research.
The drugs escaped the laboratory. And then Timothy Leary gives it a big push.
Harvard psychologist Timothy Leary developed a dubious curriculum of mind expansion and personal truth through psychedelics.
A scandal erupts. He's fired from Harvard and then decides to become the LSD evangelist.
Turn on, tune in, and drop out.
He's essentially saying everybody should use this drug. And the drug is taken up by the counterculture. Richard Nixon was convinced that he was dealing with a threat from psychedelics. He called Timothy Leary the most dangerous man in America.
The kids who take LSD aren't going to fight your wars. They're not going to join your corporations.
And here, Timothy Leary and Richard Nixon were in agreement.
So Nixon passed the Controlled Substances Act in 1970, and that listed psilocybin and LSD as no accepted medical use and a high potential for abuse, neither of which are true. And that's a remarkable event in the history of science. I don't know that you can point to another time or episode where you had a very promising line of inquiry that is simply stopped for reasons that have nothing to do with the science. And we lost 30 years of research. Imagine what we would know now had we been studying these compounds for those 30 years. What we might have learned about depression, anxiety and addiction, consciousness, and how the mind works.